Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, and I am smiling. I am. Happy to be here. Welcome to Allen Avenue, Unitarian Universalist Church, in-person and online worship. I'm Ann Packard, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I serve on the Board of Trustees. If you are new to us, welcome, and we'd love to be able to reach out to you. If you are in person, you will find a little QR code on the back of the order of service. And let's see, for our welcome form. And if you are online, please visit our website, youtube.org, to find our welcome form. Our mission calls us to celebrate diversity, encourage spiritual growth, and promote social responsibility, travel on, and care for the earth. Each month, Allen Avenue supports a nonprofit organization whose mission and work aligns with our Unitarian Universalist principles. The Share the Plate organization for October is Maine Unitarian Universalist State Action Network that we refer to as MUSAN. MUSAN is a statewide advocacy and public policy network anchored in our Unitarian Universalist faith and animated by its principles. MUSAN links 25 UU Maine congregations and many friends in an active legislative ministry. We hope you'll visit our social justice table after the service today to learn more about MUSAN, Allen Avenue Church's social justice efforts, and more about LD 1626, a bill to protect Babanaki rights by restoring tribal government to tribes in Maine. We have a few congregational activity announcements. On Saturday, October 16, A2U2 is holding a community yard sale fundraiser. Please read your e-blast for more information or contact me or Polly Juno. Next Saturday, we will also have our monthly open mic at 2 p.m. Please come for fun and merriment, share a reading, song, or any other talent. And we will be holding a cross-generational family dance on October 23rd at 4 p.m. Please contact Reverend Donna or Chelsea Ray for more information. All of these activities will be held outside.
Our call to worship words are those of the Reverend Laura Bogle. We gather here to remember this is our home, but not just ours. The land we live on, the water we drink, the air we breathe, these old mountains that hold us steady to our ground. These forests that give us their healing green, these flowers that give us their beauty and fragrance, these fields that give us our daily bread, these stars that show us our place, the wilderness and the tame backyards. We remember the ancestors who have lived on this land and who have shaped it. We honor the animals and creatures that have made their home in this land, and the ones here now and ones who used to be here. We envision the future generations who will live on this land and let their voices fill our hearts. We gather here to remember this is our home, but not just ours.
Land acknowledgement. We gather as a community, honoring this land in the watershed of the Presumpscot River, whose name means many falls in the Abenaki language of its original inhabitants. We remember the ancestors who have lived here before us, whose homeland reached from the White Mountains, Babanaki, to the ocean, Sobag, at the mouth of Casco Bay, the place of herons. 400 years ago, there was an Abenaki village at Presumpscot Falls, 1 1/3 miles from our church grounds. There they grew corn, squash, and beans, the three sisters, gathered sweetgrass, and sustained themselves on salmon, shad, and alewives swarming upriver in the spring. We gather on ancestral Babanaki land, on land that was stolen by settler colonialists and claimed by right of conquest. We commit ourselves to a process of decolonizing, of learning the painful historical truths, of working toward greater understanding and reconciliation, of becoming allies to the Babanaki tribes who are still crying out for justice and self-determination.
Our chalice lighting words this morning are those of Joy Harjo from the book How We Became Human, New and Selected Poems. The opposite of love is not love. It is fear. Where can my nation be? Hate attracts hate, and the blues are consequences of the blues. If our fear destroys love, then where can my nation be? Today we light our chalice, our Unitarian Universalist symbol of faith, to infuse our lives and choices with love. And I invite Michael up for the time for all ages.
Hello, and thank you for letting me be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Chief Poulin and the Presumpscot River, and as we look forward to Indigenous Peoples Day. But a little background on the Presumpscot River. It's 25 miles long, and it drops 250 feet. And as was said, it's the river of many falls. There was 12 sets of named falls on the river. And it's quite extraordinary to have that kind of a drop. Those falls churn up the water, they aerate it, they give the fish the capacity to breed. And when we say we had fish in this river, we had millions of fish in this river. Salmon, shad, alewife, sturgeon, different types of herring, and eels and lamprey. It was flush with fish. It wasn't that you threw a line in and catch the fish, you went down and grabbed fish. It was that much. It's top of the river would run silver at times with the fins coming out of it as they moved up in their yearly migrations. And the people that lived on here were the Abenaki, and they thrived off of those fish. They lived in villages, huts, and they had children and pets, and they made baskets and canoes, and they knew the plants and the cycles, and they'd been here for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. They had thriving communities of leadership. They interchanged leadership, and one of the leaders, the Sagamore, was Chief Poulin. And Chief Poulin was, the leadership would come about because they would find those that were the best at what they did, the best that had the best capacity for growing food and for fishing and for hunting, and then they would move into kind of a leadership position. But remarkably, they were obliged within their society to share with those that weren't as good too. And so it was kind of an equilibrium that played out. But Poulin was very good at it. He also stood up for his people. He was a tall man and known for his size, and he was apt as a one that would defend the capacity for his people to live along the river. And they lived on the upper part of the river, but they came down to Casco Bay as well. And the Abenaki were from more of the northern Vermont area. This was kind of their place where they touched the river. And the river provided really everything for them. And then there was one year when the river stopped, the fish stopped going up the river. And it was caused by the damming by Colonel Westbrook down here at Presumpscot Falls was the first dam. And it was as much meant for people think it was, well, it was for a mill dam of sorts. And the first dams were logging dams and they became mill dams. But it was also an act of genocide. They was strategically trying to starve the people out that lived up river. And Poulin tried to get them to take off the dam because it was starving his people. And when it wasn't successful here, he appealed to the governor in Massachusetts, which is quite extraordinary because he's really working within our systems, the European systems, and saying, you know, when the fish are running, we would like you to be able to have passage at the dams so that the fish could come up so we could feed our people. And Governor Belcher said, well, okay, that sounds reasonable. And he ordered the dams to have fish passage. And nothing happened. And so Poulin went back again and ordered and asked the governor to put in fish passage. And again, the governor said, Colonel Westbrook, take down that wall. And nothing happened. And so there subsequently was a war, skirmishes really, and Poulin was killed. Belcher was a friend of Westbrook, so he had no intention of him actually taking down anything. He just wanted to say to take it down. And Poulin was killed up near a fort on Anderson Road. And it's interesting, to this day, if you go up on the river, upriver from Westbrook, it's very undeveloped from Westbrook up. There's a set of falls there, which I would suggest everybody go and enjoy, off of Mill Lane and behind the Dana Wart Mill. And that was the dividing point, an agreed upon dividing point between Abenaki land upriver, Western European land, colonist land downriver. That didn't last long, as most agreements didn't. And there was the encroachment up to a fort up near Anderson Road, which is now the current River Road going to Wyndham. And so the other side of it, there was Fort Hill Road and 237, and that was the other route up going from Gorham Village up to the fort. And so you still have these kind of echoes of the past in the river today. But anyhow, he was killed. And at that point, it was sort of the dispersal of the Abenaki kind of going underground and or going into with other tribes, and then also going up to retreating further north. But one of the remarkable things was when Poulin went to Belcher and asked for this, one was that he was not asking them to leave, he was asking to share. Two, they knew how to put in fish passage. They had the technology. They didn't have to have a vast amount of studies, and they knew how to do it. And three, he introduced himself by saying, my name is Poulin, and it is the River Presumpscot that I belong to. And what that points out to me is a totally different attitude. They did not own the land, they belonged to the land. They belonged to the river. And it was a complete flip from the Western, the European perspective. And I think that's something that we really have to respect and know that we all belong to the river too. And when one honors the indigenous people, from my perspective, there's no better way to do it than to honor the things that they honored. And primary amongst those is the river. Thank you.
I invite you into the spirit of prayer or meditation, as is your practice with these words of the Reverend Lynn Cox. Spirit of life, who draws us together in a web of holy relationships. Make your presence known with us and in us and among us. Remind us that we are not alone in history. Ignite us with the courage of the living tradition. Remind us that we are not alone in entering the future. Anchor us with patience and perseverance. Remind us that we are not alone in our times of grief and pain. Comfort us with your spirit manifest in human hands and voices. Remind us that we are not alone in joy and wonder. inspire us to honor and extend the beauty we find in this world. Divine music of the universe, let our hearts beat in diverse and harmonious rhythms, cooperating with an everlasting dance of love. May we move with the rhythms of peace. May we move with the rhythms of compassion. May we move with the rhythms of justice. Source of stars and planet and water and land, open our hearts to all of our neighbors. Open our souls to a renewal of faith. Open our hands to join together in the work ahead. May it be so. Our reading this morning are the words of the Reverend Screebo. Our Unitarian Universalist faith calls us to fully examine the painful legacy of Christopher Columbus that displaced and disseminated generations of Native Americans and their rich cultures and societies. Our principles require us to respect and learn from Indigenous people and support their struggles for social justice and religious freedom. This year, many Unitarian Universalists across the country will join with other people of faith and goodwill in celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. It changes Columbus Day from a celebration of colonialism into a chance to learn historical truths about the genocide and oppression of Indigenous peoples in Americas. It can also inspire us to organize against current injustices and to celebrate Indigenous resistance.
Good morning. My name is Merritt Bainbridge, and I want to tell you about the current legislative effort to restore sovereignty to Maine tribes. But I want to start with telling you why this is a cause close to my heart. We titled the service Decolonizing, and that might sound a little stilted, but we use the active verb with purpose. Decolonizing is an active and ongoing process of undoing and dismantling colonialism, of replacing Western interpretations of history with Indigenous perspectives, of freeing our minds from a colonial mindset and engaging with painful truths, and to work towards justice, healing, and reconciliation. When I came from Germany to the United States in 1988, I was upset when I filled out my immigration papers that a government made up of descendants of colonizers was making the rules on who was allowed in and who was not. I felt that it should really be the original inhabitants of this country who should vet me. 2 years later, when I prepared for the hearing to remove my temporary status and to get a permanent green card, I gathered with friends at the banks of the Rio Grande River, north of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I lived at the time, and prayed to the ancestors of the land for permission to be here. I didn't make personal contact with Native Americans for another year, when I had the privilege to take a traditional pottery class with a Hopi teacher at the Institute of American Indian Arts, the only art college in the country teaching Native arts for college credit. I was one of the lucky 10% of non-natives that they admitted to their classes. The whole process, from harvesting our own clay with an offering of cornmeal to firing our pieces in a wood fire with prayers and chants, exposed me to a culture with deep kinship to the environment and left a deep impression on me. But I was still caught in the romantic idea of the noble savage, although I learned about the reality of many tribes living in poverty on reservations, often struggling with health problems like diabetes and alcoholism. I didn't really want to get involved. After all, this wasn't my history. And I, along with my post-war generation in Germany, had just spent over a decade struggling with the old collective German guilt about the Holocaust. So I remained an outside observer, appalled at the lack of reckoning with the history of colonialism and slavery in this country. Of course, that was a convenient lie. The anti-Semitism of my German ancestors is rooted in the same ideology of white Christian supremacy as imperialism, colonialism, and racism worldwide. In 2018, after 30 years of living in the US and 20 years after moving to Maine, I became a US citizen. And I made a vow to make the history of this country my history, and to become engaged in anti-racism and decolonizing. Being a Unitarian Universalist and a member of this church for 20 years has played a significant role in this. Like many of you, I learned through the engagement of our congregation with Babanaki Reach about the horrific history of child theft of Indigenous children and their forced placement in residential schools with a goal to completely destroy their tribal identity. The documentary film Dawnland tells the compelling history of the Maine Babanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission that worked toward healing through truth-telling. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to take advantage of the free viewing that's available until tomorrow through the Reach website, and the link for that is also on our order of service. When the UUA chose An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz as its common read for 2019, I bought the book, but it took me a whole year to read it because the account of atrocities against Native Americans is so painful that I could only read a few paragraphs at a time. It is an important read, and I think it should be required reading for anybody living in this country. And I have a copy of it on the table if you want to look at it. Then a year ago, I began attending MUSAN's Racial, Native, and Immigrant Justice Group meetings regularly. Out of the dozens of legislative bills that Musan supports each legislative session, it was this legislation for tribal sovereignty that called me to advocate for. Restoring the sovereignty over their lands to the Maine tribes goes to the core of decolonizing. Supporting it is in deep alignment with our Unitarian Universalist values. So what is this legislation about? I will attempt to summarize in very broad strokes the complicated history between the state of Maine and the tribes. And my sources are taken mostly from the Babanaki Alliance and Babanaki Reach website and links on those websites, and you can dive deeper into this if you are interested. In 1606, the Maine tribes unified as the Babanaki Confederacy, meaning people of the dawn. The Confederacy was comprised of the Abenaki, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot. Their combined land reached from what is now the Gaspe Peninsula in eastern Canada in the north to the territory of the Wampanoag in southeastern Massachusetts, from the White Mountains of present-day New Hampshire in the west to the Atlantic coast in the east. The arrival of white settlers in the 1600s, of course, brought disease, genocide, violence, and wars. Tribal lands were taken by right of conquest. Tribes were forced onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. And like Mike shared, the Abenaki were driven further and further north and eventually absorbed into other tribes. In 1794, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts signed a land treaty with the Wabanaki in the District of Maine. This treaty violated a federal law, the Non-Intercourse Act of 1790 that was passed just a few years before, which proclaimed that all interactions between Indians and non-Indians were under federal control and individual states had no role to play in Indian affairs. But first Massachusetts and then Maine, after its founding in 1820, acquired large areas of land through cessions and administered the affairs of the tribes by colonial precedent, ignoring federal law. For the next century, state policy was predicated on the assumption that the tribes would gradually disintegrate as individuals left the reservations. Tribal councils were not recognized, agreements were not honored, the tribes were dispossessed of most of their ancestral land, and they lived in poverty at bare subsistence level. And out of all 50 states, Maine was the very last one in 1954 to grant Indians living on reservations the right to vote. Fast forward to the 1970s, when federal policy was adopted to promote tribal self-government and sovereignty. In 1976, the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy tribes sued for and won federal recognition. And the two other main tribes, the Maliseet and the Mi'kmaq, followed that. In 1977, the US government sued the state of Maine on behalf of the Penobscot Nation and Passamaquoddy tribe over the illegal sale and seizure of tribal lands in violation of the federal tribes sought a return of their land and financial compensation. Both the state and the tribes rushed to settle the case out of course. The state wanted to quell the economic and social unrest that was created by the lawsuit. Many people didn't understand what it was about and were afraid that their private property would be taken by the tribes, which was not what they intended. And the tribes rushed to settle because it wasn't a presidential election year and Ronald Reagan was ahead in the polls, and he had promised to veto any land claim settlement. With help from the federal government, the case was settled out of court. President Carter signed the Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act, also known as MICSA, into federal law on October 10, 1980, 41 years ago today. Maine legislature passed it into Maine state law in the companion bill, the Maine Implementing Act. MIXA was considered a groundbreaking settlement at the time, unique to Maine, unlike any other states. As part of the settlement, the federal government placed $81.5 million in trust for the tribes to buy back a small portion of their original land from willing landowners. They were not given the land back, they were allowed to buy it back. To this day, the tribes have not been able to purchase the full amount of land provided for in the settlement. The ambiguous language of the settlement has led to differing interpretations of the law. In the last 40 years, the tribes have repeatedly gone to court against the state of Maine. Maine holds substantial legal jurisdiction over Babanaki tribal lands and tribal members. The state of Maine basically treats tribes like municipalities, subject to all Maine laws, and MIXA explicitly exempted Maine tribes from all federal policies and services conferred by federal laws for the benefits of tribes. All other 570 federally recognized tribes benefit from these federal policies and from over 100 federal laws that have since been passed. This disparity plays out in many areas, including access to federal disaster relief funds, food security, domestic violence prevention, water quality, and infrastructure projects. For instance, hunting and fishing on Babanaki reservations are critical to the tribes, both economically and for their cultural identity. Sustenance fishing has been compromised through water pollution from upstream paper mills. But current law does not recognize the rights of tribes to prosecute hunting and fishing violations by non-natives on their lands, nor to take action against pollution of the river that provides their food supply. All those violations go to state court, not tribal court, leading to judicial conflicts between the state and tribes and lax protection of natural resources. It's still the same conflict as it was between Chief Poland and Colonel Westbrook, isn't it? As a riverine people, the tribe's relationship to the rivers is one of reciprocity, of kinship to a place. To the state, the colonial view predominates. Rivers are resources to use and exploit for business. MIXA was supposed to be a living document that would be improved upon. That promise had not manifested in 40 years. Finally, in 2019, the state legislature established a bipartisan task force to review and develop recommendations for changes to the Maine Implementing Act. The task force produced a report with 22 recommendations, which formed the basis of a comprehensive bill. The bill was introduced in 2020, gained great support in the legislature, only to die when the legislature shut down early due to the coronavirus pandemic before they could vote on it. The bill was reintroduced again in the current legislature, the 130th Maine legislature, as LD 1626. An act implementing the recommendations of the task force on changes to the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act, sponsored by Representative Rachel Talbot Ross. The bill had a hearing in May 2021 this year, with over 200 individuals and organizations testifying in favor, including a representative from Musan. However, it was not voted on, but held over to the coming legislative session, which begins in January 2022, when the legislature reconvenes. The reason for this holdover was the complexity of the bill and that the Mills administration is not in favor of the entire bill. And currently the tribes are working on amendments with the governor's office in order to avoid a possible veto by the governor. But this holdover also allows the Babanaki Alliance and their allies to educate the people of Maine about the need for securing sovereignty of the tribes in Maine. Like they say on their website of the Babanaki Alliance, these are not just tribal issues. These are not just rural Maine issues. And these are not just Maine issues. These are national issues of equity and justice. And I might add, to faith communities, these are moral, ethical issues. So I encourage you to read up on this and learn more. There is a new link that was just launched on the Babanaki Alliance website, which did not make it into our order of service. Actually, it didn't make it into the e-blast, but there's a QR code on your printed order of service that brings you directly to that link. And it's a page called Take Action. And it has valuable links on how to contact your legislators, how to write a letter to the editor, talking points, frequently asked questions summary that tells you all about the bill and the history that you need to know. And I encourage you to take a look at that. So don't throw away your order of service. Take it home and utilize it later. Thank you very much.
Even though we've just begun to get back together this September in person while maintaining our Zoom connection, we are a busy congregation. Whether online or in person, there is staff, volunteers, creating spiritual opportunities, religious education, social justice, information, and organization to those in our community and beyond. It is through your time, talent, and your money that we are able to maintain our mission. Our morning offering will be gratefully received. There will be wooden baskets coming around, but if you prefer, or you happen to be on Zoom, please go out to the website and use our donate button or send your check here to 524 Allen Avenue. And on the back of your order of service, if you're here and you prefer to do it online, you will find a QR code that will bring you to electronic giving. Our morning offering will now be gratefully received. In the words of Lila Watson, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. As we extinguish our chalice, let our faith remind us that our liberation is tied up with the greater community, the world, and our Indigenous neighbors.